Today, a truly special story awaits you on our channel, Vanished Stories. We've covered many strange tales here, but today's is undoubtedly one of the most bizarre. You'll get to the end, to the big reveal, and you'll say, "Wait, what?" So buckle up. If you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories, you've come to the right place. We publish new ones every day. If that interests you, demolish the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss anything.
Relax and grab your cup of coffee, because the story begins now. Listen carefully and don't miss a single detail.
The biting Michigan air of January 5, 1909, offered no comfort as 56-year-old Reverend John Carmichael bid his family farewell. He pulled his heavy cloak tighter around his black suit, the familiar ritual a small anchor against the chill, before mounting his horse. The rhythmic thud of hooves against the frosty ground carried him away from his peaceful cottage towards a distant town and a fervent revival. Columbus, 9 miles away, awaited his sermon, a grand event meant to draw new souls into his congregation. The journey, usually a time for quiet contemplation, began with a flurry of greetings. Children, rosy-cheeked and bundled against the snow, paused their snowball fights and snowman building to wave. Their parents, too, eager for a word with the esteemed Reverend, called out from doorways and fields. Carmichael, ever the man of God, offered polite smiles and brief pleasantries, though he yearned to press on, to gather his thoughts for the impending service. Finally, after nearly half an hour of these interruptions, the houses receded, replaced by a hushed, snow-covered expanse. This stretch of road was his sanctuary, a peaceful interlude he always anticipated on his frequent rides to Columbus. Here he could truly be alone with his thoughts, shaping the words of his sermon, preparing his spirit. But the silence was abruptly shattered by the urgent thud of approaching hooves. Carmichael turned, his gaze meeting a sight that instantly unsettled him. A man, roughly dressed in a stained brown shirt beneath a long overcoat, his greasy hair slicked back, rode swiftly towards him. A wide, unsettling grin split the stranger's face as he waved wildly, clearly intending to stop the Reverend.
Gideon Browning. The name alone brought a sigh of internal dread. The Reverend knew him well, as did everyone in their small town. Browning was known for his erratic nature and, more notably, his crippling drinking problem. Carmichael, cherishing his rare moments of solitude, wished only to be left undisturbed. But the unwritten code of a reverend demanded kindness even towards the town's most troublesome inhabitant. He forced a smile, a polite wave, masking the unease that coiled in his gut.
This encounter, however, was not an isolated incident. For weeks, Gideon had seemed to materialize wherever the Reverend went, an unnerving pattern that had escalated into something almost eerie. Each interaction was a test of patience, Gideon's presence a grating disruption. And now, here he was again. "Hey, Reverend, can I ride with you?" Gideon's question, delivered as he reined his horse alongside Carmichael's, was immediate. Carmichael's heart sank. He desperately wanted to refuse, but the words that left his lips were, "Of course, we can ride together."
The regret was instantaneous. Gideon, a veritable torrent of chatter, began to speak, filling the peaceful quiet with a relentless stream of words. And not just any words. His questions were strangely intrusive. He probed, wanting to know the Reverend's exact destination, the purpose of his journey, even how many churches he owned. Against his better judgment,
And compelled by an inexplicable urge for honesty, Carmichael revealed his plans for the Columbus revival and mentioned his church in Rattler Run.
As he divulged these details, a strange fascination began to pull at the Reverend's attention. Gideon, maintaining his fixed, unnerving gaze, reached into his pocket. He produced a silver coin and began to flip it, catching it with an almost unconscious rhythm. Up it went, spinning, then a soft slap into Gideon's palm, over and over, without missing a beat in his writing. It was a peculiar display, almost impressive in its effortless continuity. More than the dexterity, it was the sound that captivated Carmichael. The gentle whir of the coin in the air, the soft slap of it returning to Gideon's hand, a peculiar, unexpected solace. It began to lull him, to soothe a part of him he didn't understand. He stopped answering Gideon's questions, his eyes fixed on the hypnotically moving coin, his mind drifting into a hazy, dreamlike state. Eventually, their horses halted at a crossroads beside a general store. Gideon pocketed the coin. Carmichael, feeling a strange passivity, dismounted and tied his horse alongside Gideon's, despite the urgent call of Columbus and his revival. He knew he needed to press on, but a silent obedience seemed to hold him captive. "We need to stop here," Gideon announced, his grin returning. "We need to get something." "Okay, what are we going to get?" Carmichael heard himself say, the words feeling alien on his tongue. "What am I saying?" he thought, a fleeting flicker of alarm. "I need to go." Yet he remained, passively awaiting instructions. Gideon's grin widened. "I'm not going in, Reverend. You are. You're going to buy me a new hatchet and bring it out here." The request was bizarre, unnerving, utterly without logic. Carmichael's instinct screamed defiance, but the word that emerged was a soft, compliant, "okay." He shuffled into the store, purchased the hatchet with his own money, and returned, placing the gleaming tool into Gideon's outstretched hand. He longed to remount his horse, to gallop away from this strange encounter, but as he swung into the saddle, Gideon spoke again. "Hold on, Reverend, we're not done yet. Now we're going to your church in Rattle Run. I'm getting married soon, and I want to scout it out." Again, the protest died on Carmichael's lips. Married? Gideon is already married. The thought was a faint whisper against the strange fog that enveloped his mind. Fear began to prick at him, a cold, sharp sensation. Yet he heard himself agree. "Okay, yeah, we'll go to my church in Rattle Run." Gideon once more produced the silver coin, its rhythmic flips a silent, hypnotic companion as they rode towards Rattle Run. Carmichael's mind swam with confusion, a growing dread, and the nagging awareness that Gideon's tale of marriage was a blatant lie. Why did Gideon truly want to go to his church? The question echoed, unanswered, in the haze of his mind. He was scared, profoundly so, but utterly incapable of resistance. They reached the church, a small white-steepled building, Gideon's coin still dancing in the air, his gaze fixed on the Reverend. As they dismounted and hitched their horses, Carmichael found himself moving with a strange automatism. He unlocked the church door, stepped inside, and walked to the back, lighting the stove. As he returned towards the front, where Gideon stood framed in the doorway, Gideon suddenly commanded, "Stop where you are." Carmichael froze in the center of the aisle. Gideon, his coin once again in motion, merely looked at him. "Do you want to look around?" Carmichael asked, his voice flat. "No, I don't need to look around," Gideon replied, the coin still flipping. "There is no wedding. Hey, Reverend, go ahead and lift up your left arm." Terror seized Carmichael. Confusion warred with a horrifying compliance as his left arm, seemingly of its own accord, rose into the air. He had no control. "Hey, go ahead and raise your other arm," Gideon commanded a moment later. And so Carmichael's right arm lifted, mirroring the first, leaving him standing, arms outstretched, like a figure on a cross. In that chilling moment, a horrifying clarity pierced the fog. Hypnosis. Gideon had hypnotized him. It was the only explanation. Before he could process the sheer strangeness of it all, Gideon's face, which had held that unsettling grin throughout, suddenly contorted. The playful glint vanished, replaced with a deadly seriousness. He stared intensely at Carmichael, then dropped the coin to the wooden floor, its clatter echoing in the silent church, and began to advance.
The next day, just after noon, the caretaker of Reverend Carmichael's Rattle Run Church approached the building. Carmichael was meant to be in Columbus for several days, and the caretaker merely intended to ensure all was in order. As he neared the small, white-steepled church, a wisp of smoke curling from the chimney immediately caught his eye. A fire was lit inside. That makes no sense, the caretaker thought, a knot forming in his stomach. The Reverend isn't supposed to be here. Who could be inside? He dismounted, and as he reached the front door, he found it unlocked. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip. He flung the door open. The sight within froze him. The entire interior of the church was awash in blood. Pews, walls, the altar, all drenched. Amidst the crimson horror, torn scraps of fabric lay scattered. He recognized one, a unique button sewn into it, undeniably from Reverend Carmichael's suit. Horror gripped him. He scanned the room, seeing no one, but a dark, gruesome drag trail stretched down the center aisle, curving around the altar and out of sight. His first instinct was to flee, to run from this nightmare, but a deeper worry held him. What if the Reverend was here, alive, in need of help? It was his responsibility to investigate. Drawing his pistol, he slowly advanced down the blood-soaked aisle, peering into the shadows. The church was eerily silent. Halfway down, a glimmer caught his eye. A silver coin, covered in blood, lay in the middle of the aisle. He continued, following the grim trail as it led past a pew directly to the stove, still smoldering, its door shut, concealing its contents. After one last hesitant look around the silent church, he reached out and opened the stove. Inside, nestled amongst the ashes, was a human skull.
The news of Reverend Carmichael's horrifying murder ripped through the town like a wildfire, scorching past its borders and igniting whispers in every corner of the region. Within a mere 24 hours, a massive police investigation was ignited, a desperate hunt for answers in the brutal slaying of a man of God. Detectives in Rattle Run swiftly connected with the sheriff of Carmichael's hometown. There, a chilling detail emerged. On the very day the Reverend embarked on his ill-fated journey to Columbus, a man named Gideon Browning had unleashed a public spectacle of rage. This explosive quarrel with his brother-in-law had been witnessed by many, a tempest of anger that left townsfolk talking. After the verbal storm, Gideon had, in a fit of fury, mounted his horse and galloped away, a dark silhouette against the winter sky. Children, bundled against the cold, engaged in snowball fights and sculpting snowmen, had unknowingly become crucial witnesses. They recounted seeing Reverend Carmichael traveling down the road, pausing to exchange greetings with them and their parents. Not long after the Reverend disappeared from view, they also observed Gideon Browning, his anger still a palpable presence, riding along the same road, in the same direction. And then Gideon, too, vanished. No one had seen him since.
Immediately, Gideon Browning became the prime suspect. The theory, albeit flimsy, was that his rage, born from the fight with his brother-in-law, had found an unfortunate target in the Reverend. Carmichael, it was surmised, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the crosshairs of another man's wrath. The police knew this explanation was tenuous, but Gideon's reputation as an erratic drunkard lent a grim credence to the idea. It was, sadly, something he might do. And so, within a day of the murder, a vast, multi-state manhunt for Gideon Browning commenced. 3 days later, 500 miles away from the desolate chill of Rattle Run, in a bustling Illinois city, a figure pushed open the door of a boarding house and stepped inside. Miranda Hughes, the proprietor, sat behind her front desk. Her eyes met the man's, and she had to stifle a gasp. He was a ghastly sight. His dark brown shirt, stained and grimy, barely concealed by a long overcoat. He shivered uncontrollably, his frame impossibly thin, his face a pallid mask. He looked, quite simply, on the brink of death. Yet, with a quiet resolve, the man introduced himself as John Elder and requested a room. Miranda hesitated. His appearance, his unsettling aura frightened her. But then, pragmatic thoughts intervened. Many of her guests were rough around the edges, and this man had money. A room was a room. She led him upstairs to a small chamber on the second floor. As he stepped inside, Miranda, extending a customary courtesy, offered, "Would you like me to bring you some food?" Without turning, John Elder replied, "No, I'm fasting." Then, with a jarring finality, he shut the door in her face. Throughout the remainder of the weekend, despite John's declaration, Miranda consistently left food outside his door at every mealtime. It was her routine, her small act of hospitality. But the plates remained untouched. For a time, Miranda worried, given his sickly appearance and now this peculiar fasting. Yet there was also a quiet relief in not having to engage with such an unsettling guest. She largely ignored him. Then, on the crisp morning of January 12th, a week after the murder in Rattle Run, and 3 days after John Elder had checked in, Miranda was crossing the back lawn of her boarding house. A sound sliced through the morning air, a pained moan, emanating from the outhouse. Normally, Miranda wouldn't dream of investigating such a private matter, but the agony in the sound was undeniable, compelling. She raced to the outhouse door, yelling, "Hey, are you okay in there?" More moans, now accompanied by whimpering, were her only reply. Driven by a surge of instinct, Miranda seized the door and flung it open. What she saw unleashed a scream from her throat.
The scene that greeted Miranda was a tableau of horror. John Elder, the quiet lodger, lay in the outhouse, his throat savagely cut from ear to ear. The wound was deep, gushing, a crimson testament to a fatal act. Miranda recoiled, a gasp caught in her throat, before she spun and ran, her feet pounding the earth in a desperate search for help. By the time the authorities arrived, guided by Miranda's frantic cries, it was too late. John Elder was dead, his lifeblood seeping into the wooden floor of the outhouse. Initially, the police saw no link between this brutal death and the gruesome discovery at Rattle Run, barely 500 meters away. 2 separate tragedies, or so they believed. But a search of John Elder's pockets changed everything. Tucked within his clothing, a blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff of Rattle Run. As the words unfolded before them, a chilling realization dawned. John Elder was not who he claimed to be.
To truly understand the unraveling of events in Rattle Run and the true identity of John Elder, we must journey back to January 6th. This was the day Reverend Carmichael embarked on his solemn pilgrimage to Columbus for the Grand Revival. It was during this journey that his path fatefully intersected with Gideon Browning. They rode together, sharing the road, stopping at the general store where the Reverend, inexplicably, purchased a hatchet for Gideon. Their destination? The Rattle Run Church. Yet the true reason behind their bizarre companionship was far more unsettling than mere hypnosis. In the weeks preceding that fateful January day, Reverend Carmichael had encountered Gideon with an unnerving frequency. It was as if Gideon was a shadow, appearing wherever the Reverend went. So when Gideon materialized beside him on the road on January 6th, the Reverend's mind screamed, "It's happening again." But his reaction was not one of simple bewilderment at a strange coincidence. Instead, an insidious paranoia had taken root in the Reverend's mind. He convinced himself that Gideon possessed a sinister power, an ability to track his every move, to spy on him, to intimidate him. He believed Gideon was a man of magic. As Gideon, oblivious to the Reverend's mounting terror, casually flipped a coin into the air, a habit of his, the Reverend's delusions spiraled further. "Oh my God," he thought, "not only does he possess the power to find me, but he also wields the power of hypnosis." The glinting coin, its rhythmic ascent and descent, became a hypnotic pendulum in his mind, soothing and controlling him. He was convinced he was no longer master of his own thoughts, his own body. He was under Gideon's spell.
Believing himself thoroughly hypnotized, the Reverend passively acquiesced to Gideon's every suggestion. When Gideon suggested a stop at the general store, the Reverend agreed. When Gideon requested a new hatchet, the Reverend bought it. And when Gideon expressed a desire to see the Rattle Run Church, the Reverend led the way. Once inside the desolate church, the Reverend, lost in his self-imposed trance, inexplicably moved to the center of the nave. There he extended his arms outward, a distorted, grotesque imitation of Christ on the cross. It was not Gideon's doing, it was the Reverend's own mind, fractured by delusion. At that very moment, Gideon, still idly flipping his coin, fumbled it. The coin clattered to the floor, breaking the spell of the Reverend's hallucination. "The spell is broken," the Reverend shrieked internally. "I must save myself." In a frenzy, he seized the hatchet he had bought for Gideon. He forced Gideon to strip naked, then took his clothes. And then, in an act of unimaginable savagery, the Reverend hacked Gideon to pieces, reducing his body to ash in the church stove.
Following this unspeakable act, the Reverend tore his own suit into ribbons, scattering the fragments throughout the church to simulate his own demise. He meticulously placed what he wanted the world to believe was his own skull into the stove, completing the grim tableau. Then he donned Gideon Browning's humble attire, the dirty brown shirt, the long coat, and vanished. He reappeared 500 miles away at Miranda Hughes's boarding house, where he rented a room under the assumed name of John Elder, a desperate attempt to escape his horrific deed. Meanwhile, back in Rattle Run, the police quickly discerned the truth. The remains in the stove, the skull, the fragments of bone, they were not Reverend Carmichael's. They belonged to Gideon Browning. The narrative shifted from Gideon being the culprit to Reverend Carmichael being the murderer. But before they could apprehend him, Reverend Carmichael, now known as John Elder, had taken his own life in the outhouse, his throat slit by his own hand. The blood-stained letter found on John Elder's body was his confession. In it, Reverend Carmichael detailed his conviction that Gideon had indeed hypnotized him, that he had acted in self-defense against a man of dark magic, a confession, however diluted, to murder. While the precise conversations between Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning during their fateful journey remain shrouded in mystery, this harrowing theory represents the most plausible explanation for the events that unfolded. It is also important to note that Reverend Carmichael's family had a history of mental illness. However, in an era that largely ignored mental health, it is unlikely that this knowledge could have prevented the tragedy that occurred.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time. See ya.